Do you want to have the confidence to truly rock retirement? Well, I'm going to show you how on the Retirement Answer Man Show. Well, hey there. Welcome to the show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. I am your guide to figuring out how do we actually rock retirement. Welcome to the show. This is the final episode of a month-long series here in February on inflation and retirement. So if you happen to be new to the show, and we always have lots of new listeners, which is awesome, welcome. Or maybe you missed one or you took a break, which is fine too. Welcome back. This is the last episode of a 4-episode series on inflation and retirement. We started with what is inflation and how do you measure it? And then we looked at ways that inflation impacts your retirement. And then last week we talked about how do you manage inflation from a strategic level. And now today we're going to finish up with talking about how do you manage it from a tactical level. That is a good framework that you'll likely hear that framework happen over and over again. And the secret is, just so you know why I do it this way and why we do themes. One is because I think it helps you and I think more intentionally about a topic in an organized way. That is really important. When I originally started the show, coming up on 8 years ago, which is crazy, the way that I approached it was I think out loud and I'm dealing with these issues in my practice with clients and I give advice and counsel. And I wanted to make sure I did it. I wanted to sharpen my own saw. So a lot of times when we discuss a topic, I'm doing it because I know it's in a topic that is important to you from a retirement perspective, but also because I want to make sure I refresh my thinking on the topic so I can refresh my thoughts on inflation and retirement so I can think through it in an organized way to discover the things I believe that really aren't so and discover the things that I hadn't thought of or that are new that I should maybe pay attention to. And I find that a very helpful cycle for myself. And then having you join the conversation like this and send me emails and ask questions has really expanded my thinking and my journey in building the wisdom that I need to help myself, but also serve my clients. And we all get to serve each other. It's a nice cycle, I think. So before we get started, 2 things. Number one is back in January, Joel Sihai came on the show. He is the host of the Stacking Benjamins podcast, as well as author of his new book with Emily Guy Birkin, Stacked, Your Super Serious Guide to Modern Money Management. So he came on the show and talked about it. And Joe is really good at community building. And he is going to have, I think it's like 15 or 20 different meetups with his community of Stacking Benjamins, where he'll be signing books, talking with people like you that are thinking about this type of stuff. So if you go to stackingbenjamins.com/stacked, you can see a list of all the dates that he's going to have across the country. And on March 1st of 2022, he's going to be in Dallas having a meetup and I will be there. So if you want to come hang out with me, meet Joe and hang out with other people that are wanting to rock retirement, come check us out and you can learn all about that at stackingbenjamins.com/stacked. Now, my second announcement is what we're going to do next month on the show in March. Now, March is a 5-week month, and a lot of the themes that we have for the show came from you in the surveys that we're doing. And we're doing one right now, by the way. I think the last week is this Saturday. So if you want to give feedback for the show, on 6 Shot Saturday, click on that link and you can fill out our reader feedback. It's anonymous and we read everything. I read everything that's written. Anyway, next month, what we're going to do is talk through in a organized way, what are the fundamentals that you need to master in order to rock retirement? We're going to define what rocking retirement means. And then what are the fundamentals, the fundies that you need to master so you can focus on those? Because if you don't master the fundamentals of rocking retirement, much like any pursuit, it's easy to get distracted focusing on things that really don't matter and you don't have a solid foundation. So we're going to talk about what rocking retirement means. what agile and agile retirement management means, what fundedness means, what resilience means, and optimization and pie cakes. I use these terms a lot in describing frameworks on a particular topic, but other than the master class, which is in the Rock Retirement Club, I don't go through them in an organized way for you to understand them, to master them. And maybe you haven't listened to the show and you hear me throw out a term like pie cake and you're like, what the heck is he talking about? So this is the chance for us to have an organized conversation about the fundamentals of rocking retirement. So I'm excited about this because some of you may be very familiar with these, but now you'll see everything in a logical order rather than a la carte. And now if you have a spouse that is not into this stuff near as much as you are, and that's typical, this would be a good series to listen to with them, because we're going to talk about all the fundamentals, but we're not going to get down deep into the spreadsheets. So this would be a good course or series for them to just be aware of, because it should be logical to them. If I do this well, they'll understand it and be somewhat engaged into it as well. We're going to start that in March. All right, with that, let's get on and talk about the tactical side of managing inflation in retirement. So now we're going to get into talking about the tactical side of managing inflation in retirement, but I have one little sidecar that I want to go to first, and that is on a question that Tanya Nichols and I answered a few weeks ago on where do people go that are seeking advice that may not have the capability to hire a full-time financial advisor or a retirement planner. And we talked about flat fee options and hourly options, and we totally missed a very obvious one that I want to make sure I mention. And Andy, I want to thank you for emailing me and saying, hey, Roger, dude, you totally missed a very obvious one. Because I did. I don't know why we didn't think of it, Andy. So I appreciate that. I'll read Andy's comment. He says, on your recent podcast with talking about people with $250,000 who were seeking advice, both you and Tanya sort of said there were no options other than paying out by the hour or maybe using some companies I'd never heard of in terms of flat fee planning. And he says, maybe you don't want to talk about the big companies like Fidelity, Empower, Vanguard. They have wonderful people working there, and he feels that they do a good job. So those are great options. So what he's referring to, and I'll just look at Vanguard because that's the one I'm most familiar with, is if you work at Vanguard for a very nominal fee, it's a little bit extra fee to the normal asset management from their mutual funds, you can have access to a certified financial planner. And these are people that are salary that you can have conversations with and have them run analysis about retirement planning using a lot of the normal calculators. I think those are excellent options. And just like anything, it'll be less customized, but still very valuable. And if you're part of one of those services and you want to ask a question, you can actually get access to a CFP to ask the question. So Andy, I appreciate you pinging me on that because I have no problem talking about anybody that I think is doing good work and is a really good solution. I honestly just didn't think about it. So I appreciate that. Okay, now let's get back to the main topic of we've outlined strategically how to deal with manage inflation or some strategies. Now, what do we do tactically? Okay, Roger, that's great. Long-term strategy, but I'm feeling some pain and some uncertainty right now. What can I do right now tactically? So let's address that a little bit. So again, what are strategic versus tactics? Let's define that briefly. A strategy is how you achieve a long-term goal, which is rocking retirement. So the first goal, hierarchy, I want to rock retirement, which is essentially squeeze out the most life I can from my retirement life. Strategy is how you will achieve this long-term objective. So the goal and the strategy, those things rarely change. Tactics, on the other hand, are small steps with a shorter time frame. So tactics are easily started and discarded. They're still a means to an end, but they are subservient to the strategy, which is subservient to the goal. And tactics are a complement to the strategy that enhances the strategy in order to reach the objective. So that's the difference between a strategy and a tactic. So let me use an example outside of the idea of retirement planning. I'll use me, okay? My overarching goal professionally, and this is the best way I know how to explain it right now, so the verbiage might not be perfect, is my long-term goal professionally is to be the exemplar of a retirement planner. I want to be the standard of how others aspire to. Not in some egotistical sense, but I want to be as good as I can be. And so that's the bar. So that is the goal of my professional journey, to be the exemplar of what a really good retirement planner is. The strategies I use to do that are to walk with clients in their journey to retirement and advise them. That's one strategy. And I can serve clients lots of different ways. Another strategy is to host this podcast so I can think outwardly and learn from people that are actually on the journey. Another strategy is the Rock Retirement Club, where I get to walk a little bit more deeply than the podcast and teach and educate and get challenged on the things that I'm educating. So the tactical things are below that. So my vision of professionally will never change. The strategies will evolve, but they'll be pretty constant. 8 years in this podcast, not going to stop. The tactics can come and go. So if you just look at somebody who is doing tactical things, sometimes they can look flighty, right? Because they're trying this, they're testing that. Like a good example for me, tactical wise, was back in November when I said, hey, I'm going to go to 2 podcasts a week. That was a tactical decision in service of the strategy. And I very quickly realized it was a bad tactic. And so I killed it really quickly. It was painful for my staff. It was a little embarrassing for me. It was confusing to you. But a tactic is something that you can move in and out of very quickly. So what might look flighty on the surface isn't necessarily so, because the strategy is always the same, and the goal is all the same. So when you're thinking of your retirement, you want to have your goal. We'll assume it's rocking retirement. You're going to want to have your strategies, which is what we're going to talk about all of next month, the fundamentals. The tactical stuff, that's the bling of planning that I call it sometimes, all the sort of cool, sexy stuff. So what tactical situation are we in currently when it comes to inflation? Well, we had the January report where inflation was 7.5% over 2021 January. The Fed has said it was transitory. Now they're not using that word anymore, which means maybe they think that inflation is here to stay and something that isn't just simply a blip on the screen, but something we need to deal with. That is the situation that we're in right now, right? And because inflationary might not be transitory, that means it could be the beginnings of a trend of higher inflation, which is a very big change from the trend that we've had of very moderate to low inflation. And that is what we're all grappling with here. So tactically, we're trying to figure out, is this a trend or is it transitory? And if it's a trend, that means that the trend of low to 0% interest rates may be changing. Because generally, when inflation is rising, interest rates rise as a tool to battle inflation. And there, some forecasters are saying we may have seven increases in interest rates this year. And that has an impact on lots of things. Inflation rising, if it's a trend, has an impact on the cost for gas and steak and milk and things like that. One of the reactions to battle inflation is changing another trend of low interest rates and perhaps having a trend of rising interest rates. That has an impact. It has an impact on the good side of you earning more money in your money market or in the CD that you get or in the bond that you buy. But if that trend of interest rates increasing rather than staying very, very low, that potentially changes the dynamics financially to everything. This is the tactical situation that we're dealing with. Now, there's a distinction. We're not dealing with the tactical situation of inflation as on an upward trajectory. We're not dealing with that as a trend. We're dealing with where are we going here? Is this a big shift in some very long-term trends of low inflation, low interest rates? Because that has been the dynamic for a couple decades now, really. That's the tactical situation we're dealing with. That is different than saying the tactical situation now is inflation's rising, interest rates are rising, and what we just saw for the 20 years is done. We don't know that yet, but this is what everybody's worried about. Because if you have rising interest rates, we have the good that we earn some money in our money markets, but interest rates goes into the denominator that's used to figure out the valuation of things. So what do I mean by that? I was talking to somebody in commercial real estate a few weeks ago who evaluates financing real estate deals for commercial properties like malls and offices and things like that. And they've seen about a 0.5 point increase in the cost to borrow money to create the mall or the office park or whatever it is. Well, because interest rates have increased by roughly 0.5% in order to borrow money to create the mall or the office park, the numbers of what they can build change, right? Because the cost of the whole project increases because now you have to pay more interest for the money that you're borrowing. And the offhand comment was, hey, man, we're looking at a deal that totally made sense to do, to lend this money and get this at this interest rate for this, say, office park. And now the cost of money to borrow money has gone up by 0.5% a year. Now the deal isn't nearly as attractive as it was. And that's a dynamic tactically that people are trying to figure out, because the value of this office park at 0% interest rate, if you have to borrow money where you're now paying 0.5% interest rate, you're paying more money. Now the value may have to come down on the project in order to make the numbers work. It's no different than, let's say, your mortgage, right? My first mortgage, I bought a $90,000 house at a 9.75% a year interest rate. And if I recall, my principal and interest payment was about $916 a month. I don't remember the math. That might have had the escrow in there, but let's just assume that's correct. That same house, well, let's do the math here. Let's just do the math. Let me get my 12 HP 12C out. Okay, 360, that's a 30-year mortgage. Do a 9.75% interest rate, $90,000 house. Your value, the principal and interest, if I did my live math correctly, would be $773 payment. So when I was buying this $90,000 house with my wife, our first house, a few years after we got married, I was very payment driven, right? Because that impacts the cash flow. Well, at 9.75%, my payment would have been $773 a month. Now, the current mortgage rates, let's just call it 3 to be round the numbers. If I were to buy that same $90,000 house, my payment would only be $379 per month. You see the difference? Interest rates impact the value of my house, because now if I say I come in and I can afford a $900 payment, that payment can support a lot higher priced house than a payment where the interest rate is 9.75%. Everybody's wondering tactically, does this mean that if interest rates rise, that we're going to see home prices level off or go down? Because now people that are buying a house based off of the payment, they can't afford as much house if they have to pay more interest. This is what everybody's struggling with. Now, obviously, in all of these examples, there are other dynamics. This is a multi-factor equation to valuations. But I guess my point is, tactically right now, we are not dealing with the low inflation that we've seen for 20 years is done. And now we're going to have rising inflation. We're not dealing with that yet. What we're dealing with tactically is we've had this long trend of low inflation, low interest rates, and we've just seen some pretty big blips that inflation is on the rise. We don't know if it's a trend yet, but if it is a trend, oh my goodness, there's going to be a lot of shifting of capital across the world. We're dealing with the fact tactically we don't know yet. So I want to make this distinction because it's very important, because if you just presume that the dynamics of the economy from an inflation interest rate standpoint is done, that can lead you to some very big decisions tactically and possibly strategically that aren't really something you know or necessarily as a high probability. Hopefully you get that distinction. Hopefully I explained it well. Okay. So now what I want to do is let's just talk about some tactical things you can do on the short and midterm to given this blip and the possibility that we have this regime change in the trend. I'll talk about that and I'll tell you what I'm doing personally and in my practice. Okay. So tactics, if inflation is on the rise and it's something that's more permanent and not transitory. Quick disclaimer here. I am not giving you advice. We're thinking out loud together. Talk to your advisor, or your tax advisor, your financial advisor, so you can make a good decision. Okay. What are some short-term things you can do if inflation is actually the trend? Well, and we've talked about these before, you can buy bonds that adjust for inflation, have some inflation adjustment. We've talked about the treasury bonds, the I bonds, which you can buy directly at the US Treasury. Those are designed so that in addition to whatever interest you get, it adjusts the amount of interest that you get based off of inflation so you can preserve the value of the purchasing power of your dollar over time. Tactical I bonds. Another inflation adjusted type bond are Treasury inflation protected securities, which are more like a traditional Treasury bond where it adjusts the principal balance of the bond based off of an inflation factor, ultimately to achieve the same goal as an I bond, except it's more like a traditional bond. It has a stated interest rate. It has a stated maturity rate. If you buy the bond today, the price of the bond will fluctuate up and down based off of interest rates and other factors. These are very tactical ways within a portfolio that you can hedge this inflation risk. Another one would be simply money markets. Don't lock in an interest rate with a CD or a bond, but hold more money market or cash assets, realizing that you're going to get less interest potentially right now, but as interest rates rise, you can lock in at higher interest rates. Because if inflation rises, and then that means interest rates rise, then you will benefit from the rise of interest rates. That is a tactical thing you could do right now. You could use more debt to buy things. So as an example, let's say you're buying a car. If inflation is rising over time, the cost of your car may increase over time because the cost of the goods to build the car increase. So usually during times of rising inflation, using cheap money, locking in a 0% interest rate or a 1% interest rate, locks in the purchase price of that asset. So using more debt as inflation is rising, assuming you do it early enough, can allow you not to have to pay as much for something you might have bought a year or two that costs more. That's very different than the dynamic that we've been in recently. If you are a cash buyer, say of a home or a commercial real estate property or something like that, you could almost take the opposite tact and say, I'm going to wait a little bit because if interest rates are rising, that automatically will put pressure on the value of assets because the cost of borrowing to buy the asset, like we talked about, would make the payments different, which would potentially, we could see the prices come down. Doesn't guarantee that it will, but these are tactical considerations you could consider in battling inflation. I'm not endorsing any of them. You could very practically buy in bulk, right? If the cost of toilet paper is increasing because of inflation and you think inflation's here to stay, probably always going to need toilet paper, buy in bulk so you can buy at today's prices rather than having to buy more at tomorrow's prices. Let's talk about work. Inflation can be painful because companies may lay people off, but one place that we're seeing some inflation, which may be a good thing at the moment, is in wages. Absent the arguments of minimum wage and things like that, the labor market is very, very tight. Employers have a hard time hiring people. You've probably seen this at the places you go around your community, but it's the same way for white collar work and high skilled blue collar work. They can't find people. And we've talked in the economic news previously about how wages have not kept up. They've been fairly stagnant. Perhaps we're in the midst of a adjustment of that where wages are going to rise. And I talked with my wife who was in recruiting and HR for decades. Her number one piece of advice typically is if somebody wants to earn more money, typically you got to switch jobs. So if you are still employed, that becomes a more attractive option. And just the dynamics of things that companies are so desperate for talent, they have to go out and find it, and they're bidding up for the talent. That is a much easier way of getting paid more money than somebody that you're already working with that already has a structure around you, because they have political concerns. If I give you a raise, then what about every these other people? Very similar to phone companies. You always get the best deal on a cellular phone package with the new provider, not the one you already have. So as a worker, you have more leverage here. So that's possibly a tactic that you could explore. Investing wise, what assets generally do well? I'm not saying these will, with rising inflation. You have real estate, because they have the power to pass on rents to the landlord or to the lessee, the person that's renting the office building or that they're renting the house. Companies with pricing power, meaning that their products are so attractive or so necessary that you have to buy it no matter what, or you will buy it no matter what. So when they have an increase in cost due to goods, they can pass it right along to their customers very easily. And then commodities generally do very well in rising interest rate environments. These are generalities or potential tactical solutions. Okay, that's a survey. And I'm going to be honest with you, I wasn't going to say this. I have a feeling those of you that are very tactically oriented are going to be very unsatisfied with this discussion. I just do. I just don't feel like I'm going to give you all the cool stuff maybe you should go do. I'm sorry. So what am I doing personally and professionally? Again, not recommendations. So what I'm doing. Not much. I'm not really doing much tactically. Personally, I have a lot of liquidity. I think we talked about this last week. And this is true with clients too. I like the barbell approach during especially seasons like this. I have a lot of liquidity on one end, not a lot in between, and then a lot of risk assets that are long-term growth oriented on the other end. Very volatile on one end, very safe on the other end. It's called a barbell. Personally, if you looked at my balance sheet, that's roughly what it looks like. With the clients that I work with, that's roughly what it looks like. Lots of exceptions, of course. Why? Because it helps me not have to overthink things and play all these tactical games. I am much more focused on having what I'm trying to accomplish for myself or with a client clear, and then having strategies that are focused on accomplishing the goal, and the tactical stuff becomes much less important. Because if you build strategies fairly well, everything works out. Rising interest rates, falling interest rates, rising markets, falling markets. If you get your strategies right, and your strategies are focused on something that you truly want to accomplish, then the tactical stuff becomes much less important. Does it mean you don't do any of those things? Maybe you do. Maybe you do a little bit. Maybe in your bond portfolio, as a tactical example, if you're supposed to have 40% in bonds, maybe you have a lower duration or maturity of bonds so they don't get impacted by inflation as much. You can do some of those little things. The key with tactical things, if you really focus on the strategic and the fundamentals, you can ignore most of them, and it will right itself as we go through cycles. And if you're agile, you'll iterate, so you'll make lots of little adjustments rather than some drastic adjustments because we're worried or excited about something. But if you are going to do tactical elements like selling your entire bond portfolio and going to cash because you don't want your bond portfolio to be impacted by interest rates. If you are going to do tactical things, my experience has been the wisdom is not to do extreme things. Don't think with so much certainty. In a bond portfolio, we'll use this as an example. If you want to be tactical, remember, you got to the percentage of bonds through your strategy that was focused on your goal. So we already have that well thought out as to why we're doing this. If you want to be tactical, it shouldn't be binary. I either do it or I'm all out. If you're going to be tactical, make sure you only give yourself enough rope to lean a particular direction. Maybe you lean a little bit to cash and not bonds with your 40% in bonds, say, or you lean a little bit more in lowering the maturity so it doesn't get hurt by interest rates. And you decide how much you're willing to lean strategically so you don't lean so much that you're getting whipshawed every time you change your mind on what you think you need to do. I'm not a big fan of extreme decisions based off of outside forces like the markets or interest rates or the economy. Because if you say, I know inflation is going to be going up and we're about to go into hyperinflation. I've read all the articles. They all make sense. And I've read them too, by the way. And then a lot of them make sense. So I believe this is idiotic, what's happened in the markets. Interest rates are going to skyrocket and we're going into hyperinflation. It just makes sense. Well, if you have that amount of certainty based off of a lot of really, really smart people, that sort of paints you into a corner because now you need to align all your decision making with an opinion that is fairly extreme that requires a lot of things to go your way, right? And now all of a sudden you're buying all crypto and all gold, you've sold every stock, and you've painted yourself into a corner where you have to have your thesis prove out. Not just prove out within a relatively short mid time period in order to reap the benefits of all the decisions that you've made. And if it doesn't prove out, you're left holding the bag. That is the situation you don't want to get into. And we saw that happen a lot after 2008. A lot of advisors got into this. After the 2008 economic meltdown and market meltdown, you saw advisors who saw the data and understood more than most what was going on and how fragile everything was and how it could tip over at any time. And they recommended their advisors get out of all of their stuff, buy gold, do all these fancy strategies out of a good intent, but poor analysis. And then once you do that and you're wrong, which they were back after 2008 and 9, they painted themselves into a corner where the markets are taking off, which makes them look wrong. And now it's, do I stick with this conviction that I had? Am I just right and it's taking too long? And now we're here 13 years later. Some people never came back to stocks. They missed the last 12 to 13 years of amazing markets. Jason Zweig wrote the article that we talked about last week. That's where we have to be really careful tactically. And that's one reason why I'm probably not really satisfy those of you that are wanting to be really tactical. Sorry about that. All right. A little bit of a rant there, I think. But I think it's really important. And this is one reason why we're going to go back to the fundamentals next month, because in moments like these with interest rates and the economy and everything going on, it's important to remember the fundamentals so we can work our protocol. Because I can tell you personally, I read all the same articles. I'm reading all the same things that you are in the research. And intellectually, I'm like, yeah, I get that argument. I get it. I see the data. I understand what you're saying. But over 30 years or so, I've learned how being really smart doesn't make you right, and that everything is much more complicated than we give things credit for. It's much more multidimensional, and it's a much more complex system than anybody appreciates and that anybody can actually figure out. And that's one reason why I approached Agile. So that's my wisdom on this. I'd be interested in your feedback on this. Now, quick note, we're going to go to Coach's Corner with Kevin Lyles, who I love. We shortchanged a few listener question segments this month, and we're going to make that up in next month. So I apologize if we said we're going to answer your question this month and we didn't. But with this, let's go chat with Kevin in Coach's Corner. So it's that time of the month where we have our Coach's Corner with head coach in the Rock Retirement Club, Kevin Lyles. How you doing, Kevin?
Good afternoon.
Hot topic today, inflation. This whole month has been, well, this is one that it's on everybody's mind.
Sure is. You can't run into anyone on the street without them bringing it up, can you?
What was interesting is just anecdotal. My sister-in-law went to buy steaks because she was having everybody over for dinner, and she was going to buy fillets. And actually, all the fillets were gone and the strips were there, which you'd think would be the opposite if people were that concerned about inflation and trying to save money.
Yeah, that's one of the ways to manage it, right? Substitute goods. So,
yeah.
Well, I wanted to talk about a couple aspects of it. The first is how retirement calculators, those calculators we use to see if we have enough money to retire. And it bothers me the way they treat inflation, because they ask you to plug in your planned spending for the year when you retire and then inflate it by some percentage every year until you die. And I think that really does a disservice to retirees, because people don't spend money that way. All the research shows that after about age 70, people's spending tends to drop. And so if you come up with a plan and then inflate it every year by just say 3% or whatever you choose. Now, some people are saying, should I be using 4 or 5%? Then what you're doing is you're being way too conservative, and you're leaving a lot of life unlived. And I don't like that.
So you're talking about if someone just says $100,000 is what I need to spend, and then they just use a long-term calculator to inflate that.
Exactly. They go 100,000, 103,000, 103,300, and just keep inflating it. And by the time you get to age 80, you're spending $200,000 a year. And like I say, I just don't think people spend that way in retirement. So my only comment on this is just be careful when you use those calculators that you're not doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah, because it can drastically overestimate how much you need.
Exactly.
Potentially.
And when you do that, you're not spending that money when you want to spend it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the number one things that I see people. It's a good rule of thumb to start off with, for sure.
Exactly. Your first plan, that's a great way to do it, right? But then I think you need to get more personal in there. A lot of people talk about figuring out your personal rate of inflation, and I think that's often a lot less. I'm only 4 years into retirement, so I don't have a lot of knowledge on this one, but my spending has not gone up with inflation so far. And most of the retirees I talk to in the Rock Retirement Club report the same thing.
I have a couple thoughts on it. I agree with you 100% that it can cost you your life, the go-go years, if you use that type of assumption. The other thing I think, too, in a practical manner, and I made this comment the other day on the show, is I don't have anybody that just automatically increases their spending by a certain amount every year. Generally, they're spending what they, if it's 100,000, they just keep it at 100,000. Then every now and then it ends up bumping up.
Yeah. So you're saying no one uses the 4% rule, right? Because that's what it did, right? It said start at 4% and then increase it by inflation every year.
Yeah. I think, again, it's just a good rule of thumb, I guess. The other thing I see, and it'll be interesting to be a little part of your journey on this, Kevin, is I have a client I'm thinking of right now who she is 83 and she has no signs of slowing down her spending. She's still going. It's amazing.
That's great.
And she's been blessed that she was able to do the go early and that she had the good luck of the roll as far as markets and inflation and everything else, that everything's just kept up.
Well, there is a point in there, Roger, that I think people need to think about. We've had for years, we talk about go, slow go, and no go being 65 to 75, 75 to 85, and 85 and over. I don't think that's true anymore. Longevity is really increasing that period of go years. And so I know a lot of 75-year-olds that are very active. I was playing pickleball this week with a 93-year-old. And he was winning games out there.
Well, he was playing you, though. I mean, so that's understandable.
Well, that's true. He didn't have good competition, but just watching him out there was nothing slow about his game. And so all I'm saying is don't just think there's 10 years and then you're going to stop spending.
Yeah.
That period of spending may last a lot longer, right?
So what about the non-financial part of inflation? Is there an aspect there?
Yeah, I love that, because we think just about inflation and economics, but a lot of things inflate in retirement, and most of those things are good. And the most obvious one is the amount of free time you have, the freedom you have to do what you want. And I think the great way to manage that inflation is to avoid becoming bored, to continue to do new things, new activities, try new things out. And that's a great way to use that inflation of that new time. You can't get bored if you're doing new things. Another one I hear about is the number of relationships and friends that you have. The research on this one, Roger, is so clear that the more friends you have in retirement, the happier you are as a retiree. Every study that's ever been done, get out there, engage in different core pursuits, as Wes Moss, I think, calls them, that come with their own set of people that you interact with regularly. And that's a great way to inflate the number of friends you have in retirement.
Do you think in later retirement, just simply having friends and core pursuits, do you think that's as fulfilling as building a career or raising children? Or
I really do, because you have to internalize it. It's what's important to you. And sure, when you're young and you have great ambition in a career, that's important to you. But as you get older and I think more mature, relationships become more important. And if you're engaging in activities with people you really enjoy their company, you can learn from them and grow with them. That becomes just as important as a career was, I think.
Yeah, I think of my father-in-law and my mother-in-law who are in their 80s. And like my father-in-law especially, he doesn't have a lot of friends, but he has obviously his golf and things like that. But he gets a lot of purpose out of just simply going to people's houses and fixing things.
Sure.
Which is being useful.
And I'll bet you like that core pursuit of his, don't you? Does he make it over to your house?
I'll tell you, over the 30 years I've been married, it's awesome because he grew up rural Virginia, coal mining country. And I mean, literally worked at General Motors for 30 years. He can fix anything and jerry rig it if he doesn't know how to do it. And I didn't grow up like that. So it's a godsend to me. I realize what the price is. The price for him fixing everything and putting in hardwood floors, which I could do, but not as well, is every time he comes over, hey, Roger, how's that doorknob working? How's that working over there? I'm like, it's awesome, Dave. Thank you.
Yeah. It's great to have a family member like that. And that just brings to mind, Roger, I'm talking about friendships and social relationships. The relationships you have with your family really can grow deeper. And that's a great part of retirement. If you have grandchildren, that's a very special relationship. And those kinds of bonding activities that you can do with grandchildren or your own children and other family members, those become really special and can take the place of some of that focus on the career that you had earlier in your life.
Well, amen. Well, I appreciate your perspective.
Good to talk to you again, Roger. I'll talk to you in March.
All right, let's go set a SMART sprint.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to set a little baby step you can take in the next 7 days to not just rock retirement, but rock life. So in the next 7 days, I want you to just think about where you're at on this strategy versus tactic things. And if you're going to do tactics, that's totally fine. Then I want you to define the guardrails so you don't give yourself too much rope that compromises the integrity of your strategy, which is focused on your goal. Because that's the main thing. Always make the main thing the main thing. So I just want you to noodle on that and come to some decision for yourself. Hey there, before we end, I just wanted to say, hey, how you doing? Hope you're having a great week. I've been really on this kick of reading books. I've always read books. I've had books around me, but now I'm reading more books than I ever thought I would as consistently. At least I'm building that habit, which is really cool. And as I was getting ready just to say hi to you, I got this book from Bruce Lee, Striking Thoughts, Wisdom for Daily Living. And I literally just turned around and it was sitting on my bookshelf. If you've watched any of our live meetups on Zoom, you've seen my bookshelf. I didn't put it there. My wife must have dropped it off. I order so many books, but listen to this thought. And I think this is a good quote for how I want to be with you. A teacher is never a giver of truth. He is a guide, a pointer to the truth that each student must find for himself. A good teacher is merely a catalyst. Bruce Lee. Oh, I love that. And I think I try to honor you in the terms of this show is I'm your guide. I want you to figure out how you rock retirement and not tell you what to do. I want to be your catalyst. So I'm cool. I literally just picked this up. I hope you have a great week, and I hope I am honoring you as we guide each other to rock retirement. Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize this is helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.